Oasian efforts. It's that Atavistian time of the month. Oh, let's go with two things. All right, maybe three things. I'm trying my damnedest to make the Atavist pod an extra pod like I did back in the day before the Clone Wars. 2, spoilers, okay? 3, this is a great reminder to also subscribe to Pitch Club at welcometopitchclub.substack.com so you can learn how to write better pitches and sell more stories. I often feature Atavist writers on Pitch Club because many of them are pitching cold. Our guest today was the very first Pitch Clubber, and a new one drops tomorrow. That's welcometopitchclub.substack.com. Forever free, baby.
I know that editors are always like, why now? And I'm like, I don't care. It's a good story. That's why now.
Oh, hey, CNF. It's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I talk to tellers of two tales about your mom. Sorry, I can't help myself about the true tales they tell. We've got Nick Davidson returning to the pod because he has, within the span of about 2 years, landed another story with our dear friends at the Atavist magazine. Nose to tail, this is one of the best Atavist pods you're going to hear. And I've done dozens upon dozens of these. I don't know what was in the air, but Jonah Ogles, the lead editor, and Nick Davidson were in the zone. I'm very excited for you to sink into this one for reasons I think will be clear once you sit with it. Head to magazine.atavist.com to read the story and consider subscribing. And no, I don't get kickbacks or commissions. I, in fact, pay for my own subscription. So stick that in your pipe and smoke it. Nick's story chronicles the undercover operation to take down dozens of poachers in the San Luis Valley of southern Colorado. The federal agent at the heart of it, George Morrison, goes undercover, and what follows is a riveting story that raises all kinds of questions and blurs the lines between right and wrong. It's titled Big Game. Colorado's San Luis Valley was a wildlife poacher's paradise. Then an undercover federal agent arrived. They know how to write a head and deck. Am I right? Am I right? I am right. Right? I'll give Nick a more formal intro as we dig into his part of the program, but for now, show notes to this episode and more at brendanamaro.com, where you can read blogs, learn more about our featured writers, and sign up for the Pitch Club Substack or my monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter, which I'm thinking of making increasingly personal, for lack of a better term. It's always been to some extent, but I'm not going to be afraid about being on the edge of discomfort with it. And if you want to support the podcast with a few dollar bills, you can always head to patreon.com/cnfpod and see what tier resonates with you. Some get you some one-on-one phone calls, coaching for lack of a better term. Everybody who pays has access to the Flash 52 sessions, which has been just this Sunday morning writing group where we just write for 30 minutes. We talk for 5 at the start, write for 30, 5 minutes at the end. And we just hang out and basically write flash essays. But you can do whatever you want. You can journal. You can work on something longer, or you can work on something short. That's what I tend to do. Flash 52, patreon.com/cnfpod. Okay, so we're going to hear from Jonah Ogles, and it's one of his best appearances. He always brings it, but for some reason, this one, I don't know. It's one of his best. It really is. You're going to be a better writer for it, I'm sure of it. And this episode, of course, will pair well with Nick Davidson's first appearance on the podcast, which is titled Episode 461 for Nick Davidson, Stories Hunt the Storyteller. Episode 404, Hanif Abdurraqib's Nod to Witnessing, and There's Always This Year. And even going way back to episode 50, Ted Conover's deep dive into immersion. So let's cue up the montage and get a gander at Jonah. Riff.
Am I allowed to swear, by the way?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay. Are you just fucking insane?
Just kind of a sloppy person.
No, I'm still such a fuck up. I'm going to be a fuck up probably for the rest of my life.
This is going to have to interest somebody somewhere other than me.
In the past, because you kind of know the book on them a little bit, and they know the book on you, so you're already at like a different level of understanding going into a story.
Yeah, it makes it really easy. You know, when the idea is good, it makes it harder to reject them.
Yeah.
Because I mean, there are a lot of writers we've worked with, and they send in pitches, and I like working with them, and I'd love to do it again, but when the idea isn't right, it feels sort of extra crappy to
Yeah.
to reject somebody. It's like I know you, I like you. It's just this one isn't right. So when it does work out, it's just like a great feeling.
I imagine that it's real hard because you have to stand behind, what you do with the Atavist. You can't even like tweak the standard just a little bit just because you've accepted a piece from somebody you've worked with before. It still has to be like, your high standard, even though you know that they're capable and good. It's just like you can't really bend the rules just because you know them a little bit. It's like it's still got to be a great idea and it's still got to fit perfectly with the
Yeah.
mag.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, we've had some that have come in that even stories that like personally I was kind of excited about, but was maybe like another historical, like another story from 100 years ago when we've already run like three in the past year, and so things just don't always line up. But thankfully they did with Nick because it's a great piece, and it just, like the editing process was so smooth. Like we've already sort of like we know how the other one works. We sort of know how to compromise and how to like make our argument without upsetting anybody or being unnecessarily mean or like offending someone without meaning to.
Yeah.
So it made it really easy to just like do the work, move it along, and everybody. It's just a smooth process with everybody happy. So.
In your opinion, what do you think is the fundamental difference between people who become editors and people who primarily become writers?
Oh, I think writers, there's sort of like the writers I most enjoy working with, I think have like a reporting itch that needs to be scratched. They love that sort of like chase of just like getting material, which Nick found some really great stuff for this story. So I think that's something that like I don't personally have, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I think that might be part of it. But well, like with this story, for example, there were a few places where I might have edited something because just in terms of story, like maybe it got a little slow in a particular place. I feel like what I can bring to a piece is just making sure that it really moves at a good clip, like especially at this length, which is a little, writers don't really write many stories at like 10,000 words, so like the pace is a little bit different, but certainly at this point I hope I've got a good handle on how to do that. So I'm really looking at that and like is information in the right place. But Nick would say, well, hey, we cut this little bit of a quote here, but in his mind that is a quote that really makes this character, like rounds him out in a way that maybe he's not without it. And that's, like it's almost like the attention is a little bit more granular maybe for the writer, whereas like an editor is more concerned with like the bigger scope of the piece, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
For sure. And it's because you didn't do the information gathering and didn't put in, that kind of effort to get the material, you're not as wed to that material the
Yeah.
way a reporter might be as well, because like, oh my God, this thing took me a year to procure. It's got to get in the story. But like, you might be like, you know what, dispassionately speaking, it's not doing as much work for the story as it was the effort for you to actually get it. So like, for the story's purposes, it shouldn't go in, but for the reporters, like, oh my God, I worked so hard to find this person. And, now we're not going to use that piece. So like that,
Yeah,
that
exactly.
distance is great.
Exactly. Well, and there are times where it should come back in, like I think with Nick, in most of the cases, I was like, okay, let's do it. Like an extra sentence is not going to hurt
Yeah.
the pace too much, So like where it's not doing, you do reach a point in the editing. Like I feel like when I first go through, I'm pretty brutal, and just like get it out of, I almost like adopt like an angry persona, and I'm just like throwing paragraphs out of a piece. But once we reach the point where we're like in layout, and like I sort of reach a point where like, okay, I think like the story is like 98% there. I think that's a good time to start compromising, and being like, okay, if Nick's gonna feel better having this extra sentence in this quote, like let's do it. If there's no harm done, I'm much more open as we move along to like sneaking things back in here and there. I think Nick has figured out, from editing the first piece that's kind of how it goes, and it worked well, I think.
Yeah. And what are the phases, or maybe you can talk about the phases of how you approach an edit from when you get that first draft of submission to the draft that is heading towards layout?
Well, basically like structure. Structure is sort of the first thing I pay attention to, so like I read it, I make notes, I see where information is and where I think it should be, and I start moving things around, and also identifying any holes that I think might be there. So there's one, I would say the first phase of my editing is just sort of like the scaffolding, building that out. And sometimes there's some cutting involved in that, but for the most part it's just like getting things in the right place. And then once all the information is there in roughly the right order, which sometimes I have to go back to a writer before I get into this, but sometimes it's all condensed into the same edit. But then I really start cutting for pace and get it down to, I'll set like I usually have a good sense once I've read the story how much of it needs to go. Like, oh, this feels like a 12,000 word story or a 10 or 15 or whatever. And I'm trying to get us pretty close to that. And then I go back to the writer with various questions and let them kind of do their thing, and then I give another round of really tightening it up, and then Sayward really gets into the lines, line by line. She's such a good line editor, and that always like puts the polish on what I hope is basically like a rough, pretty close sculpture of what I want the piece to be. There are phases. It's sort of like big picture, and then you drill down and down and down as the story progresses.
And if on average, how long is that process from that first draft to like where it's starting to get that line edit, top edit from Sayward?
I think at our fastest we do it in about a month. Sometimes a little less. It depends on how quickly the writer can get it back to me. I usually need, I don't know, I would say like a week, but that's with my weird schedule of like also dropping kids off and
Yeah.
going to doctor's appointments and things like that. But probably like 16 hours or so, a couple full days of just really being in the piece. And then if the writer can turn that down around in like a week, then it's another day or two from me and another day or two from Sayward, and that's it, and we can move that fast when we need to. But I would say more realistically, like a writer they need some time usually. Like I just sent one back to a writer, and she wanted like a month with it because there was extra reporting she wanted to do, and I had flagged some things that she wanted to dig into more. And when we're not just like tight against a deadline, we try to give writers the time they need to do that, because every story is, you want every story to be its best version of itself,
Yeah.
and if that's going to take some time, if the writer feels like that's going to take some time, great. Like we want to give the story the time it needs.
Yeah, and with given that you've working with Nick before, and he had a story come out, I don't know, ballparking year and a half or 2 years ago or so. When you get a pitch from Nick and having worked with him, what have you come to expect about a story that Nick pitches?
Well, he's gotten very good at pitching. He's one of those writers that, like, when I see like a pitch in the subject line, I'm like, oh, this will, at the very least, like it'll be a good read. Like even if it's not for us, Nick has done his homework. This pitch, for example, he pitched, and I had questions about it, and he was like, Well, I do have a draft if you want if you want to see that, because the reporting was done, and I said, yeah, send it over, and we read it, and we were like, yep, we can start editing this, like it's in a good enough place. So he's really like he does the legwork ahead of time, and it really shows, in both in terms of the quality of the pitch, which is it's so detailed. He has such a good sense of like what the story generally is and what its possibilities are. There's none of this, I hope to talk to X, Y, and Z, or I hope to also get these sources, which we get a lot of that from writers. And not that I blame them at all. Sometimes that's just the way it is. But with both the stories Nick has done for us, basically the reporting was done. And that just helps when I have questions, he's got answers. There's no like, well, I suspect this, but I'm going to have to see, which is always reassuring to an editor when you're asking questions and you're getting like solid, detailed answers, even if he's recognizing like, hey, I'm not going to be able to get this information, but here's what I have. It's still like something concrete that we can sort of wrap our heads around and know how it's going to work into the story.
Right. Yeah, that's really well put. And with Nick's story, as you know, I always love getting just a sense of maybe unique challenges for you editorially of working with it. And just for this piece, what was a unique challenge or a challenge that was unique to this piece for you?
Yeah. Well, it's about the San Luis Valley in Colorado and New Mexico, which I lived in New Mexico for a long time. So it's a place I know fairly well, and I've spent a lot of time camping and fishing up in that part of the world, and so I think that brought something different maybe to like my editing sensibility. Like I'm aware there's a section in the piece where Nick rightfully gets into sort of like how this sting was received in the valley, because the valley is like 3/4 Hispanic. These are families that have been there for like hundreds of years, predating the United States, or certainly the area being part of the United States. And there are a lot of like racial tensions in the in the area, because white settlers came in and white landowners come in, and this was what I'm trying to get to is I felt responsibility. I think Nick did too, to like both tell this really amazing story, which is, kind of has like thriller aspects, but also like not gloss over, the harm it did to this community, just in terms of like, here comes this undercover agent who his investigation results in the arrest of like 58 people in the community. And I wanted to make sure we portrayed that accurately and sort of sympathetically, even though like these guys were breaking multiple laws. So I'm not excuse their behavior at all. But I was sensitive to that, certainly, as I worked on the story. I think Nick was too, living out there. And one thing that I thought Nick did a really good job of is, Morrison, the undercover agent in this story. I think he did a good job presenting the ways this was probably difficult for Morrison, as he lived in this community for so long and developed what I assume was like something like a real friendships with people. And yet he was gonna, he was investigating them. He knew if he was successful, they were going to end up arrested. And there are moments in the story where you can sort of feel that tension. I mean, one big challenge in the story is that Morrison wouldn't talk to us. The guy that the story is about wouldn't talk to Nick for the story, so we had to rely completely on existing public documents, and luckily Morrison recorded a bunch of conversations, took detailed notes, so we have like plenty of scenery to work with. But he didn't, either wasn't able to or didn't want to talk about this part of his life, and I'm guessing that's a little bit because of what we've been talking about, where, he's in a place where he built up some friendships in the course of the investigation. And, and then ultimately like sat there and watched them get arrested because that was his job. But it's still, that was one of the things we talked about in the early stages of assigning this, is like, can we get to him? What happens if we can't? And how do we feel about that? And those were conversations Nick and Sayward and I were having.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, it's a great story, what I've come to expect from you guys, and certainly from Nick, going from hot air balloons to now this undercover poaching story, kind of a Sting, Donnie Brasco kind of thing. So it's just a great story and great insights on your part, Jonah. So we'll kick it over to Nick now. And as always, thanks for the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Sweet. Right? I thought so. So now we welcome back Nick Davidson, who can be found at nickgdavidson.com or on the socials at Nick G. Davidson on the gram. His work has appeared in Outside, Men's Journal, Truly Adventurous, Garden and Gun, High Country News, Backpacker, Vice Sports, and Popular Science, among others. Yeah, there's something of a Buddhist vibe to Nick. I don't know if that's appropriate for me to say, but I said it. If that offends you, Nick, I am very sorry. And that he's this eternal optimist, and he surrenders to the current, though not in a passive way. I know that sounds contradictory, but what I mean is he's not one to frantically paddle upstream. He practices in the martial arts, which imbues him with a sense of confidence of mind and body. He preaches non-attachment, which is a very Buddhist thing, which is always good, materialistically, of course, but also when it comes to stories that might not pan out. He is of abundant mindset, and he very much had me questioning my headspace, which, as you know, is a cesspool of toxic goo. So in our conversation, we talk about how he established a freelance career, pitching, excitement for the story, having a positive attitude, telling the story that's right in front of you, Google alerts, writing long, developing character, beginnings and endings, and when the magic happens. I think you're gonna leave this chat feeling energized at possibility. Maybe that's just me. No parting shot to this episode, as it will be part of tomorrow's, which is to say, episode 525 with Mary Kane on your regularly scheduled CNF Friday, where I'll riff about the Eugene Marathon and my library keynote. Yes, I did not die. Here I am, in the flesh. So for now, let's welcome back the inspiring and brilliant storyteller that is Nick Davidson. Yeah, and I think a good on-ramp to talk about is, and certainly a lot of freelancer types listen to the show, and whether they're mid-career or just getting started or later or who knows, how did you establish momentum as you were ginning up the freelance mill?
In general, I mean, it was kind of a long, slow process for me. I mean, I was initially, so I started out doing fact checking for Outside Magazine, and then kind of building two smaller pieces from them here and there. And over the years, kind of just doing a lot of small pieces for various magazines and building up my network, basically getting more experience, trying to pitch bigger and bigger stories, getting a lot of no's, and including from Jonah at Outside when he was there. And it just kind of happened organically. I mean, interestingly, and I can tell you more about this specific story. It kind of started with this story, with another editor contacting me and sending me a couple of ideas and saying, do you want to write for us? We're about to launch a magazine. Here are a few stories that we think would be cool. And I ended up picking this story. And like I said, I can get into that more. But once I connected on that, that first long form assignment, I just kind of got more opportunities to do so. And each time that experience would build on itself. I'd get better at what I was doing, understanding how to look for stories or receive stories that come to me and find ways to pitch them, make sure they've got what they need to really fill out a longer narrative. And I think I just, in the process of that too, I think I'm now pretty good at pitching. I don't think I used to be. So I really honed my pitching skills, and we had talked last year about a pitch, my first pitch for the Atavist. And I kind of just got a sense of how to interest an editor and then follow through with the story. So it was all kind of building on itself. And I knew from the beginning that I wanted to do longer stories. And so I was always kind of aiming there.
Yeah, how do you or how have you captured the interest of the editor? What has worked for you that might be universal in that regard?
A number of things. I mean, first of all, showing excitement for your story and believing in it, and letting that confidence really come through in the pitch, saying like, I know this is good. I'm going to tell this story for somebody. You're going to want it to be you. So a little bit of that attitude, I think, is useful. And
Some swagger.
yeah, you got to have a little bit of swagger and believe in yourself and believe in your story and trust that. But in terms of actual pitching, you've got to have the goods. I mean, you can't just come across a couple of interesting lines and say, hey, I think this could be an interesting long story, and then throw it at the editor. I mean, you have to put in the time and the work to really know that you have enough material, that you have access, and then present that in a way that is engaging. And usually in a pitch for a long form story, I like to include some in-scene writing and kind of show that cinematic nature, and make it clear that you understand what the story is and what the arc of the story is, and that it does actually have an ending, even if you don't know all of the details that will get you there. You just have to do some upfront work to really display your writing skills, your reporting skills, and the fact that you have the materials or documentation or connections to launch forward.
Yeah, that's such a fine balance to strike. So how have you started to really calibrate the degree or how much legwork you do up front, so you're not wasting your time, but you're also substantiating this pitch that you want to land?
Yeah, I don't know if I have, other than just, like you said, you can do too much work, but I think the bigger danger is doing too little work. If you're doing too much work, I would think that it's because you have enough confidence in the story, and you believe that it will follow through. So, I mean, I don't know. I can't speak for anyone else, but I operate with a certain amount of just kind of self-delusional confidence. I don't know. I mean, I'm an incorrigible optimist, and I just, like, I actively practice believing in myself, and I think that's important. I mean, having a positive attitude, it's not going to get you everywhere, but it's going to be a good start. And I've always believed that with a story, especially a big story that is going to require a lot of your time and effort, you have to believe from the beginning that if this story is engaging you so deeply that you're willing to spend this time even on just a pitch, you're going to be able to find other people who are interested. I'm not, everyone's unique, but I'm not unique to the extent that I'm the only person interested in this story that I believe is worth telling. So if you believe a story is worth telling, do the legwork, up front, to make sure your pitch is really good. You need to make sure that the editor kind of can't say no, unless they just happen to have, like a similar story in terms of theme or setting or something. And that's not your fault. And then you go to someone else, and you're going to find somebody. For me, this story in particular is a case in point for that.
Yeah, you say actively, practicing that belief in yourself and confidence building in yourself. What does that look like? What does that practice look like?
It's definitely a fair amount of positive self-talk. I mean, I don't know. Again, I kind of just only know how to be myself, and I have a lifelong relationship with martial arts. I started when I was 9 years old in Taekwondo, and I've studied some other things here and there, but that in particular, right from the beginning as a kid, like, it really instilled in me just a self-confidence. Like it's one of the core tenets of my school, hanging up on the wall, self-confidence, among other things. And so I think I kind of just got lucky in being surrounded by, when I was a kid, adults who insisted that I believed in myself, and I've carried that forward through things like meditation and, taking care of my physical body, my emotional and spiritual self. Like it's sort of a holistic practice that happens to feed into storytelling because I'm a storyteller. That's what I do. But it would feed into anything that anybody chooses to be. I don't know. I mean, other than just, again, like that positive self-talk, just thinking positively every day, identifying the things you're grateful for, the abundance that surrounds you. I tell myself every day that I'm grateful that I get to tell stories. Not everybody who tries to does. I mean, it's hard, and it can be hard when you feel like you're not connecting, and when you feel like you're failing, or people just aren't understanding why you want to tell this story, and you can't quite articulate it, and you learn from that. But even throughout those kind of disheartening times, which they're going to come no matter what you do, you just say, okay, this is what I'm meant to do, and I'm sure as hell going to find a way to do it.
Yeah. How has that attitude gotten you through the inevitable slumps that you experience as a writer, certainly as a freelance writer?
Yeah. I mean, I think it helps having other, in the case of being a storyteller, having other stories kind of in the mix, or other ideas. I keep a document that I call my nonfiction compost pile. I have one for fiction too.
Mm-hmm.
I keep ideas of little snippets of things that I've heard, or like an article that I've seen that kind of mentioned something, but it didn't really dive deeper into it. And I think it could be interesting to do so. And when you have other things to fall back on, it's easier to kind of just pivot and say, okay, this one didn't work out. That's going to happen. Like I said earlier, that if you really believe in a story, you're going to find somebody else who believes in it too, and who is interested. But that doesn't mean that at every stage in your career as a storyteller that you are going to be able to clearly articulate why a story needs to be told or what's good about it. I mean, especially in my earlier years, trying to figure out how to even pitch a story and what that entailed. Sometimes I didn't really deliver on why this was a story worth telling. And sometimes, again, you can't help certain factors, like what a certain publication just published, is about to publish, the editor's mood, what conversation they had around the table in their story meeting that week. You can't account for those factors, but at a certain point, it's just a matter of intuition when you understand that it's time to let a story go if it's not landing. And then you turn to something else. And that letting go, I think, is an essential practice too. You have to be able to really practice non-attachment as a writer in so many ways. And one of them is when a pitch doesn't land and you get rejected, you let it go. You can let that story go, and you are going to find something else, because there's no shortage of stories in this world of human experience and non-human experience, for that matter. You're going to find other stuff, and you kind of just need to like go to the next thing, start working on something else.
Yeah, that's really well put, Nick. And when I was talking to Jonah, he was just asking me just various things that I was working on. After dealing with this book proposal rejection after like a year of having worked on it, and then it was like rejected in 3 days. So it's like super depressing. And then like pivoting, then I was like, all right, should I do some other book ideas or some other magazine ideas? And I've got like a few, and each one has its merits. And then sometimes you can talk yourself out of pursuing anything. You can talk yourself into pursuing too many. But sometimes it's just best to just, I don't know, maybe just flip a coin or draw a straw and be like, all right, that's the one I'm going to work on, and screw everything else and move on. So when you've got a bunch of ideas, how do you decide, you know what, I'm going to not distract myself with all the other ones. I'm just going to pick this one and give it my all until something tells me I got to move on, or it's published and you move on at that point?
Years ago, I was living at an ashram in Virginia in the mountains, and I was working with this Swami teacher who was just really, you know, she had so many profound things to say, but I was, you know, kind of not like right at the beginning of my career necessarily, but I was early into, I hadn't done any long form stuff. I was kind of trying to figure myself out. And I actually, I asked her that very question one time because she knew that I was a storyteller and trying to be more of one. And I was just like, God, there's so many things that interest me. Like I am such a deeply curious person that I've got this idea and that idea, and I start working on this one, and another idea comes in, and it's like you almost get bombarded when you're a curious person and you're paying attention to the world. Like I said, there's no shortage of stories. And I was kind of torn, like I don't even really know what direction to go. And in the way of all wise people, she said a very obvious and yet revelatory truth to me, which was, I was just like, how do I know what story to tell? She said, tell the story that's right in front of you. You know, go for that one. And it sounds so simple and also kind of like, well, what the hell does that mean? But what it meant for me and what it continues to mean is that you have to get out of your own way, you know, like you really have to tune in to your own intuition. Like you have to have a good antenna for that. And when a story grabs you and isn't letting you go, and that's the one that you keep thinking about and your attention keeps looking over here to that story. Why do I want to tell that story? I don't know. You pick that one. I mean, you know, there are other stories right now that I'm interested in and that I've been kind of digging into a little bit in the last year or two, just periodically. But this one that is being newly published with the Atavist, that's the one that was really right in front of me. I think it's important to develop an understanding of your intuition or an ability to read it and just listen and get out of your own way and tell the story that's right in front of you.
Yeah, that's really, that's tremendously insightful. And I think as sort of embedded in that, and we might have talked about this either on our pitch club appearance or the last time you were on the podcast proper, almost like these idea of like stories choosing you.
Yeah.
And like if you can practice a certain measure of non-attachment and then maybe just surrendering to the one that is kind of just naturally has its own little riptide and you just let it pull you out to sea and just like, all right, see where this one takes me. Does that kind of resonate with your thinking of these stories, that maybe the one in front of you, it's just, kind of surrender to that. The other ones aren't going away. Just maybe go for this ride.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's something kind of ineffable about the whole process, really. Like, I think, as I said before, I like to think of it as the story hunts you, and you can't be you can't be too coy. You can't be hiding behind the bushes at every turn. Sometimes you have to just jump out and say, like, I don't know, hit me with something. and I don't know why it happens or how it happens, but I know that it does. And I don't ask too many questions of that process, but I trust it and let it resonate, let it strike me, let it kind of court me almost, and when we kind of when we get to know each other a little better, we say, okay, I think there's something here. Let's make it official.
Yeah. And, I've looked at other writers and how they look for ideas. And I think Jeff Maish is his name. He writes a lot of cinematic profiles that get optioned for lots of shit. And so he's made something of a name for himself. And he's someone who goes to, like, he'll go on eBay and get like old magazines from like the 80s and 90s and page through them. And you'll kind of like you'll be like, oh, here's a piece that's been reported out, like, but there's definitely something more there. And there's nothing distance from the past that you can actually, like, people have forgotten about it or it's been buried by other headlines, and then you're able to maybe flesh that story out more. So it's a long way of me saying, like, how do you like to find your stories to lean into?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jeff Maish is great, and he's right on with that, because you can't go from what I said about letting the story hunt you and just like stand there with your arms raised, waiting for the lightning to strike, you know.
Come to me.
you have to participate in the hunt. Yeah, the going through old magazines, that's a good route for sure. I kind of just, old or new, when I come across some piece of news reporting that, just in the way that daily news is kind of typically a little bit superficial, they'll kind of mention something, and so I pay attention to those things, and I say, okay, nobody really seems to be diving deeper into that one or two sentences, but that sounds like a whole story in itself. So you pay attention to that, you just mark it. And again, I put it in this nonfiction compost pile, and I periodically go through that. And because I don't do newsy reporting, I don't really do topical stuff too much these days. I know that editors are always like, why now? And I'm like, I don't care. It's a good story. That's why now. So I'm just kind of paying attention to things that appear in other places, and making note of them and writing them down, and kind of just putting it aside and letting it percolate in my subconscious mind. I also, when I feel like I'm interested in a particular topic, or even like a series of words that I think might create or might bring interesting things to me, like I'll do Google alerts for a phrase or a word that's a topic, and just get like a little weekly email sending me little news bits related to that thing. And it can be something as simple as, like, I think, I don't know that this has really churned up anything for me, but a phrase that, like, for the first time, and I guess this is more relevant if you're, doing like scientific journalism or something like that. But if you, for example, have a Google alert for the phrase "for the first time," or was surprised by, like, it's gonna grab from all kinds of different areas, and you'll see what people are interested in and surprised by, or what they're encountering for the first time. And other than that, I don't do too much that's really like articulable or repeatable. I don't know. I'm just always curious, and I have that turned on as much as possible. And I pay attention, and somebody says something out in the real world, and I make a note of it. Somebody writes something in the online world, and I make a note of that. And you just follow your curiosity, and everybody knows how to do that, even if they think they don't. It just takes practice.
And so how did you find this story that ultimately is running on the Atavist?
This was in 2018, summer of 2018. A guy named Greg Nichols, who is a writer, reporter, and an editor. And he was launching a magazine called Truly Adventurous magazine, like the next January. So I think they launched January 2019, and he was just gathering writers. I don't know how he had come across my name, because I hadn't written any long form stuff. I'd written kind of like medium length stuff. Apparently something about what I was writing clicked for him. He sent me an email, and we talked, and he had a few ideas for me of stories that he wanted to use to launch Truly Adventurous, and this was one of them. And I said, well, this feels like it's right up my alley, and literally it's 2 hours north of where I live in Santa Fe. And I started reporting this story, and the guy at the center of it, the undercover agent, George Morrison, I had his phone number because Greg had spoken with him a few years back. And I called him. He answered and said maybe he wanted to talk, but he was going on a trip, and I don't know if that was true or not. But he never answered another call again. And I called him, I don't know how many times over the years, but so I couldn't get in touch with him. I got in touch with his boss, who wrote a chapter in a book about this operation. I talked to him, Terry Gross. He was a really interesting guy, and just said the most ridiculous things that I loved. And he was super kind. He invited me up to his home outside of Denver, and we were going to do like a couple of days of interviews about this topic. he was going to feed me and put me up and all this very kind stuff. And 3 days before I was supposed to go visit him, he sent me an email. He took a bad fall and was entering the hospital. And next thing I hear from his wife, he had some other issues and basically went into a coma and never woke up.
Oh my God.
And yeah, which was really sad. I mean, this was a one of a kind guy, like I said, really kind, sort of this cowboy. He, talked funny, said all kinds of different like crazy things. Like he told me to get my carcass up there, and he was gonna, it's just the way he talked was a bit ridiculous, but I loved it. And then around that same time, I had spoken with Jim Bensley, who was the civilian taxidermist sidekick, basically, for the agent in this story. And I did manage to talk to him for a good long while, but I didn't know it when I called him, but he was actually in the hospital when we talked, and he didn't sound great. I mean, in the words of Terry Gross, he sounded like a car hit owl, which is again a ridiculous thing to say, but he wasn't doing well, and then he died. And I did just to continue this story, I was trying to get something, like anything, out of this story, and I made a FOIA request to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to get all of these investigation reports and audio cassettes that I knew had been recorded in the course of this investigation. And they said they didn't have these documents because they destroyed them. It's like their policy to destroy all of those kind of documents like 15 years after the case closes or something. And so they just didn't exist. And I was like, all right, I can't tell this story. There's nothing here. And the guy at the center of it won't talk to me. So we kind of had to shelve it. We worked on some other stuff for Truly Adventurous. And then in the summer of 2022, and this is just another one of those instances of paying attention to your intuition and following it, even when it's not logical at all. I was actually working, I was beginning to work on my last Atavist story, the balloon story. But for some reason, I just kept thinking, like, there's got to be more to this Operation San Luis Valley thing. Like, can I find anything else here? Could I revisit this? And it had been a few years, and I just started Googling around. I read an old story from Westward from the early 90s. And in it mentioned a guy named Jim Durr, who, according to that article, was supposedly had been working on a book on this operation. And I was like, I never heard about a book about this. I'm pretty sure that doesn't exist. And it didn't. But I ended up looking around for this guy, Jim Durr, to see what he had, and I found his son on LinkedIn, Nick Durr, and messaged him, and just, it was one of those things where I was like, okay, this isn't a super common last name. I'm just going to randomly message people with this name who live in Colorado. and it worked. And it turned out that this guy, Jim Durr, had recently passed away, but he had left like a treasure trove of all these documents that he had been using to report this book that he never ended up writing. And so his son invited me up to Colorado to stay with him and spend an entire day going through all of these things, like just file cabinets full of stuff. And among other really good stuff, like old news clippings from that time, and some of the agent George Morrison's surreptitiously recorded audio. He also had like his own audio cassettes that he was he was interviewing people along the way, and it was very fresh because this was the early 90s and it happened in the late 80s. And he also had like 7 or 8 huge binders full of every one of these investigation reports that the agent wrote down and took notes on and everything. The only source, or the only one of these sets of documents in existence as it happened, because the the Fish and Wildlife Service had destroyed all of theirs. And the guy let me, he let me take all these things home as much as I wanted. I just sifted through it, and so I suddenly had all I needed, even if I hadn't talked to the agent. And these reports were kind of amazing. I mean, like, they documented the dates that everything happened, who was doing what. There were like 108 subjects that, just 1,200 pages of documentation, and like a lot of really good quotes. Like, he wrote a whole narrative about every one of these days, and it was really interesting reading. So it's like, I've got scenes here, I've got quotes, I've got all these crazy things that these poachers were saying. And I just knew it was going to work. And so I got back in touch with Greg at Truly Adventurous, and we wrote up a new contract, and we're going to do it again. And right before I started writing the first draft, or I think I had written the opening scene, which is essentially the same opening scene that I have now. He's like, all right, we're cutting back. We're like way backlogged with our stories. We got to drop this one. Sorry. And so I took it elsewhere, pitched it around. Rolling Stone ended up buying it, and I wrote a draft for them last summer. And then that fell through, and they killed it. And I was like, you know what? When I was writing this story, I was kind of writing an Atavist story, and I knew it at the time. Like, I had just written the balloon story, and I was like, I kind of want to just write in that vein again. And so I said, since I basically have this cinematic narrative that was written as if I was writing for the Atavist anyway, so I'm gonna pitch Jonah. And I had sat on it for a little while, and so it was just in like February that I pitched Jonah. He took a read of the draft, and we're like, yeah, let's do it. We'll make it our next story, and here we are.
Yeah, he said that you're a remarkably good pitcher, and but did you hesitate because, wow, they just ran this balloon story, they publish 12 stories a year. There's no way they're gonna like greenlight another one from me like within a year and a half or whenever the other one ran.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely thought that. I was like, there aren't that many slots. I don't want to take away from someone else. I mean, not that I would, they're gonna take the stories they want, but I wasn't sure. I was like, is this too soon? I know people have written multiple times for the Atavist, but I just said, what the hell? Like, I think Jonah's going to like it. Let's just go for it. Even if they had to sit on it for a while, that would be fine. But yeah, and then it just moved really fast from there, and they wanted it.
Yeah, because you had done so much of the legwork up front. You knew, like, basically we're writing the Atavist, like, to your point, you were writing an Atavist story all along. And you had done the work, and you're like speaking their language. So this, once you handed it to them, it was probably pretty smooth sailing, from there, I imagine.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I honestly, like, I had a pretty solid draft that was,
yeah.
It didn't need a lot of work in terms of like restructuring and all of that sort of thing. I knew it needed some cutting. I tend to write long, and I do that intentionally. I like to lay my cards out on the table for the editor and say, like, hey, here's what I've got. I kind of know what I think is good, and I know maybe what's not working, but I'm not the smartest person in the room here. So I like to just write long and work with the editor to sculpt it down to its, most essential and best version.
How do you develop character in narratives like this, especially when they're starting to die and then you have to rely on a lot of other things? How do you develop character for these narratives?
I kind of just let the story guide me. I let the characters come through in the material. And so I get a certain sense of people when I'm reading about them and about what they're doing. I think it's really important for any kind of story, but especially one in which there are, quote, villains or bad guys, or, whatever you want to call them, to remember that all human beings are complex. And so if I start thinking about a person one or two dimensionally in the terms that, like, I was reading these investigation reports from the perspective of an undercover agent who had a job to do, and he was, pretending to be their friend to whatever extent it was a pretense. And so you kind of have to understand that the perspective of these reports and the perspective of the chapter on this investigation from the agent's boss, like they're coming from the perspective of a federal agency, from the government trying to address criminal activity and lock people up. But people are never just criminals. And I really wanted to try to understand where they were coming from and what the place that they, how the place that they lived and came from shaped them and shaped their actions. And so for me, part of developing, if that's the right word, the character, or coming to more deeply understand the characters in this story, was trying to get at their complexity and learn some of the history of the San Luis Valley and its people and how they culturally, like how they felt about hunting versus poaching, how they connected with the wildlife, their economic situation there. I mean, people were pretty hard up for cash and sort of desperate for even finding ways to just buy Christmas presents for their kids, and yet they did some egregious things and said some bad things, and you have to just let all of that coexist. The paradox of what it is to be a human being when you're doing something bad for a complicated reason. And I mean, this was something that I thought about a lot and sort of struggled with because I really didn't want it to be one-sided. I didn't want to present anybody as being clearly a villain or clearly a hero. Even the agent himself, I think I understood, was a complicated character who had ultimately like morally complex relationship with the people and the valley that he was investigating. For me, I think probably the easiest way, other than just, again, like getting out of the way of the story and letting what you know of the characters just come through rather than trying to shape them as if you're creating them, but trying to understand them more deeply and understand that the good and the bad coexist, and to just show that whole picture.
Yeah, the story of poaching and poachers isn't black and white. It's not necessarily. There are people who are maybe that land is, let's say, native to them, and then sort of colonial rule will come over and dictate a certain subset of rules to people who have been there for hundreds of years, and then suddenly, this thing or this connection they have with hunting and spiritual connections to various animals, and then they're told they can't hunt that, and it ends up becoming this really complex issue. And just what is your relationship to understanding maybe where the poachers are coming from? How has that changed over the course of your reporting?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this kind of moral complexity is one of the things that really drew me to this story, because it wasn't clear, even on any given day, how I felt about it. Other than, I tend to, there are two things at work, I'm a nature lover and, I love the wildlife. So when I read about people who are just decimating the wildlife in an area, I'm like, well, that's not right. I want to stand up for that. And I want to kind of out these people, there's a little bit of that attitude, but then you have to think about, again, like what you said, these people and their ancestors had been in this area for hundreds of years, well before the United States even existed. And they have a certain relationship with that land that you have to ask yourself, to what extent is it even sensible that some authority, some entity thousands of miles away is telling you how to relate to that landscape? There is a certain inherent unfairness there. And I tend to, when it comes to questions of a government or an authority versus the people, I tend to want to side with the people. I mean, there's clearly a dramatic difference in power there typically. Even though this story began as coming from the perspective of the federal government, essentially, I wanted to think about what it meant to be the people in this valley. And I don't live in and I'm not from the San Luis Valley, but I've lived for many years in this general area, in this landscape. And so I've come to understand a bit about how people who have been here for a long time tend to feel about the land. And I knew that it was complicated. And I also knew that part of the complication is that, again, when it comes to a government, a distant authority telling you what you can and can't do, people tend to recoil against that and side with one another to side with their community. And so even when people were noticing that there was a lot of egregious killing of wildlife here, and they don't, historically support poaching or I mean, poaching is sort of just a legal term, but to support killing without need, they didn't look on that favorably, but they weren't going to say anything because, they don't want to, out their friends and their community to the federal authority that they're not really too keen on.
Yeah, and then George Morrison at the center of this and embeds in this community as an undercover agent. And like you said, you called him several times and he never picked up, so you never had true access to him. And yet he's very central to the entire story. So, just for you trying to construct a narrative around a spine that was evasive, how did you pull that off?
The way that I really got to understand as much as I could George Morrison's perspective and position and attitude toward all of this was one through Terry Gross, who I did talk to before he died, and he told me a little bit about George, and he told me a little bit about Jim Bensley, the taxidermist he worked with, and I was able to talk to Jim Bensley, and he told me a lot about Morrison as well. And really, though, reading these investigation reports, I mean, there are hundreds of them. I think there are a couple of hundred officially, a little more than that. You do really get a sense of, like, he's being official, but he can't help but put a little bit of himself into that. And he's got, he documents quotes not only from other people, but his response to those people. And so there are conversations you can become privy to when you read through these, and you get a sense of how he is. And I did have a couple of his audio tapes with, like, let's say half a dozen conversations out of 280 that he recorded. And you can hear, like, I think hearing people talk gives you a sense of them. And granted, he's playing a role and he's playing an undercover role, but he's also being real. And I think one of the things that he had said, so I have a series of interviews that he did with Greg Nichols, the guy from Truly Adventurous, and he did talk to him about this and about some other investigations, and his attitude about it came through pretty clearly. And you got a sense of how he felt about these people, and even though he was playing a role, one of the things he said about being undercover is that, in his training, the best way to actually play an undercover character is essentially to be yourself. You don't change too much other than your name's different and maybe some details here and there. But if you're from Ohio, you don't pretend like you're from anywhere but Ohio, because you've got to talk that reality, and you don't want to slip up. So there were a lot of ways in which his actual personality and kind of the ways that he seemed to think and feel would come through, and I would pay attention to that and grab hold of those details, and to the best that I could, I would present that. I mean, I really wish I could have talked to him. I wrote down so many questions that I was going to ask him if he ever talked to me, and I'll never know some of those things, but I did the best I could with what I had.
Yeah, what would you want to ask him if you could get him on the phone?
Well, I mean, a lot of it is like, what do you feel about this? Because that's something that he never said overtly, that you have to kind of read into how he felt or might have felt. And I didn't interpret that too much in the story other than things that appeared to be clear. But yeah, I kind of wanted to ask him, like, I know you were pretending to be friends with these guys, but were you actually friends with them? Like, sure, you were hanging out with them for 2.5 years. Surely you must have had fun sometimes, right? Like, you guys are just hanging out, drinking beers, watching a football game, that kind of thing. Like, how did that feel to kind of be friends with someone, but then also ultimately betray them and kind of pretend to be something else? That was one thing. And just, I don't know, certain details about various scenes and things that had happened.
Yeah, and as you get to the end when the raids are on, like it's very cinematic and it's like almost an action movie in a lot of ways, like Black Hawk helicopters coming in like like overkill, and they were criticized for the degree to which they stormed into the valley to apprehend everybody. It's just like, yeah, what did you make of all of that as you're just constructing the scene, but also stepping back and be like, holy shit, like this was intense.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the questions was this overkill? Was this excessive? And I think it's debatable, but I mean, I kind of just saw it as like, wow, they really went for it. I mean, Morrison had to finally step aside and just say, yeah, like everybody come in, dude. These are the guys that I got the goods on, and maybe I liked a few of them, but they did what they did, and now you guys are gonna take care of the legal part and see how it falls out.
Yeah, and also give us a sense of, as this one woman, Shirley Romero Otero, said about the grave sense of betrayal that everyone felt when Morrison up and left and sold everyone out.
She kind of even got a little bit emotional about it. She didn't know George Morrison personally in the sense that she wasn't hanging out with him, but she knew a lot of the men that he was hanging out with and hunting with, often illicitly. And one thing she said that struck me was, afterwards, these are men that are like in that culture, like they're pretty macho men. There's that machismo element to their attitude. But in the wake of this ordeal, they would come to her, just these big burly guys, and they would just like cry and feel like, I mean, a little bit of sense of victimization, but also I think, like, how could this guy have done this to us? And this isn't fair, and this isn't who I am. Yeah, I did this action. I committed some crimes, but like, I'm not a bad guy, and people really felt hurt by that. They didn't often really, like, I don't think they were mean to people, but I don't think that they tended to welcome in a lot of outsiders in a deep way, generally speaking. So when this guy, George Morrison, who went by the name John Morgan, when he came in and kind of like duped them, into feeling like he was one of them and he was trying to make his way there, they're a very close community in the sense that they would just help one another out, and they really took him in, and they fed him, they hung out with him and their kids, and I think they just felt like, if this guy could do this to us, then anybody else could at any other time. And that was one of the deepest scars for them, is like they've lost their sense of trust, to whatever extent they had it, for anybody who was an outsider. They're just suspicious, and that's this happened, we're like almost 40 years ago now, and they're still upset about it. So yeah, that struck me.
And I love how you open the piece and how you close it as well. How were you thinking about how you ended the piece and started for this in particular, but also just in general about how you're getting into a piece and ultimately what you're leaving the reader with in the end?
Yeah, I generally want to start with something that's exciting and kind of, in medias res, just without a lot of context. Say, here's a scene, and it should be something that is not only engaging but kind of pivotal in a way, or revealing. In this case, I went through a number of possible scenes that I could have opened with. At one point, I was considering opening with John Morgan's arrest. You know, George Morrison, when he was arrested by Fish and Wildlife of Colorado, or the Department of Wildlife, and ultimately, I thought that didn't really work, and because that was kind of like, that was a really pivotal moment in the story, and I wanted that to actually be kind of more of the physical hinge of the story and put it in the middle. So I tend to like something that's got a little bit of action to it, just a really good scene that, in this case, I think there's like a couple of twists in it. And the first one comes quickly, which is, you know, you have a deputy sheriff arriving at the home, waking up this guy, John Morgan, at night, who's a known poacher, or known to be working with poachers. And you think, oh, he's coming to get this guy. And then he says, hey, you want to go kill some deer? So that was the first twist. And then, you know, I hope everyone's read the story, but the twist being, you know, the guy's like, I sure hope you're not a federal agent, because if you are, I'm going to kill you. And he's like, yeah, of course I'm not. And it turns out he is. So I liked that sort of double twist where you're kind of like pulling in the reader in a certain way, and then it takes a turn, and then it takes another turn. And both of those things really set up what this story is going to be. So that felt like the perfect scene to open with for me. And then I kind of go back and explain the context, and then basically chronologically go from there. The end, I never really know exactly how I'm going to end a story, typically, from the beginning, but it's one of those things that I feel out as I'm writing. Like I always write an outline, and I had an outline for this story that I then promptly ignored, and had a whole structure document, like in a whole chronology document, and kind of just seeing how I could lay things out. And one of the cool things about the way I ended this story is that I had no idea that I was going to do that, and that was going to work as perfectly as I think it did. I feel really good about it. It was just like, I was kind of just writing thinking like, yeah, the end will come when it comes. Maybe it's just purely chronological, but it turned out to be this more thematic ending that came to me when I realized I had this audio that I had transcribed of this conversation. And it was sort of amazing that I had this conversation, because I only had a handful of them. And when I read it at one point, it was Chief, this guy Chief, who's one of the poachers. They're having this whole really interesting conversation about poaching and about animals and their attitude toward it, and yet how things are dwindling, and the days are different. Like, we no longer have these huge herds we once had. And then Chief says, it ends. Everything ends. I mean, and he says something before that, but I just thought, oh shit, that's my ending right there. Because you're right, this story also ends. And it just felt like, when I tuned into that, I kind of just felt like it really resonated in a way that no other just purely chronological ending could have, because it told you so much about how these people thought about the moment, thought about poaching, thought about their own lives, in a way, their own mortality. And it was also kind of revealing in the sense that there was, even though they didn't really know it consciously, there was this sort of portent of their own doom, you know? And I just love that. So it was a case of, as I said before, really listening to your intuition. And that's the one thing that I've gotten good at, is kind of letting not only my intuition, but like the story itself, or the muse, if you want to call it that, guide you, and being open to it, and kind of without really thinking too logically and analytically, like stepping back and letting that magic happen on its own, and getting out of the way. And so I felt like that was one of those cases where I got out of the way, and I was happy about it.
Yeah, I love it. It's so great when something of that nature, it just clicks and you couldn't even think about it. It just sometimes happens and you're like, oh, damn. And the only way that that happened was because you had the practice and the rigor to just stick with it. You know, you had to sit down, you had a deadline, and you had to write. You didn't maybe know where it was going, but sometimes just by the virtue of being at the keyboard and typing away, these things emerge and be like, oh, there it is, like you said, and it emerges, but you can't intellectualize your way through it. You just got to grind your way through it, and these things tend to emerge if you allow them to.
So I'm a big fan of Ray Bradbury and have been for a long time. And one of his opening essays to a story collection, he mentions he's a fan of the filmmaker Federico Fellini, and he quotes him as saying of his filmmaking, "Don't tell me what I'm doing. I don't want to know," which I think is great. And it's just, I sometimes I try to do that and think about that. Like, it's definitely worth interrogating yourself and what you're doing and why you're doing it, and to understand where you're coming from as a storyteller. But I think it's also important to like not pull the curtain back all the way, you know, and let the magic remain magic, and understand that your subconscious mind there's always going to be those layers of depth that that you don't understand and maybe aren't meant to. And so you kind of don't ask too many questions of that. You let it happen. You're like, yeah, so I don't want to know what I'm doing. Just let it happen.
Well, that's awesome. Well, Nick, I feel like we could talk for like 10 hours
Yeah.
about this kind of stuff. Maybe one day we will. If we're in person, we'll just have a good day in Santa Fe or something. But until that day comes, we'll have to sunset this conversation. But as you know, I love ending these with a recommendation of some kind for the listener. So I would just extend that to you. You know, you get to give another recommendation to the people out there.
Yeah, I think my recommendation right now would be everyone should look into Deepak Chopra's 21 Days of Abundance, a series of, it's 21 days of meditations, journaling, daily affirmations that just totally reframe your understanding of psychologically and your relationship to the notion of abundance in terms of, I mean, it could be anything like financial abundance, success, and how you view it, and just noticing all of the abundance around you. I mean, it's everything, even just from like, it's a nice sunny day here, like this abundance of beauty. And I think it's really useful just as a human being and as a storyteller, especially when you come across those kind of disheartening moments of why am I doing this and this is difficult. That goes back to that kind of positive mindset and the active practice of building that. I've done it a couple of times. I did it again recently, and it really does. I mean, it works wonders in terms of your own attitude and how you view the world, how you view what is possible for you to create and call into your life. And I think that that's worth cultivating.
It sounds like it'd be a great exercise for people who might experience like envy and jealousy too, to realize, yeah, maybe there are certain things that I want to grasp at, and like maybe other people have that I feel like I want, but I feel like this is a good way of, I don't know, grounding you in a certain measure of gratitude, and realizing like if you cultivate a better attitude about things, you know, the things might come your way, maybe not at the pace you want them to, but maybe it'll happen, but it'll certainly give yourself the best shot at it. And this seems like a good practice for that.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the daily affirmations, the one that I tend to like to repeat is, I create my personal abundance from an infinite source. So if you think about that, like there's no reason to be envious of anyone else. Like when you notice someone else's success, whether it's in your field or a different field, rather than feel bummed that it's not your success, you say, okay, that's a thing that's possible. I can do my version of that. You know, like there's no specified amount of success for a writer, you know, like we tend to think in terms of limited resources and, you know, how much people are paying for what. But no, you are drawing from an infinite source of possibility, and you can create whatever you choose to create. So yeah, it's like it's another way to see other people's success as just part of the greater success of humanity or of storytellers. Like, yeah, that person's got this new book out and they won this award. Hell yeah, good for them. Like, that's a win for life. You know what I mean?
For
So
sure.
I think it's worthwhile.
Awesome, man. Well, I'm so glad that you had another piece in the Atavist, which gave us a great excuse to fire up the mics and talk again. So just thanks for carving out the time to do this, Nick, and thanks so much for the work. And look forward to doing it again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Brendan. A lot of fun as always.
Yes, awesome. How great was that? Thanks as always to the Atavist magazine crew, magazine.atavist.com, to go subscribe, to Jonah and to Nick for coming back on the show to talk some shop. Hope you got a lot out of that. You can always go to brendanamaro.com for show notes, patreon.com/CNFpod if you want to support the show with a few dollar bills. That would be nice. So consider that. And you can always follow the show on socials. Instagram's at Creative Nonfiction Podcast. And there's the Substack Pitch Club. Welcome to pitchclub.substack.com. It's part of the CNF Pod expanded universe. All right. This was an Atavist one. We're going to be right back at you tomorrow, depending on when you listen to this, for episode 525 with Mary Kane. So for now, stay wild, CNFers. And if you can't do, interview. See ya.